Tennessee. My father was here serving as the chaplain at the prison prior to the prison that preceded Riverbend. And my mother came to join him and left a career in social work and teaching to join him. And we lived here for about a year and a half. Moved to Atlanta soon after that. And I grew up in Atlanta as a son of the church. Third generation United Methodist minister on my father's side, and fifth generation United Methodist minister on my mother's side. And I grew up in those kinds of churches where each and every day God was made relevant to the issues that we faced, the challenges that people faced, particularly black churches and those black congregations that cared about the world that we had to deal with. And so you didn't have to wonder whether God was real, and you didn't have to wonder whether the love of God was real. You felt it inside those caring communities. And so those are the kind of churches that shaped me. And in that regard, I became a son of the church, a deep love for the church, particularly the black church. I grew up in Atlanta, went on to go to Emory University, where I studied English literature and African American studies, double major. Went on to study at Gammon Theological Seminary at ITC, and studied biblical studies and theology, and finally completed my education here again in Nashville, where I took a PhD in religion at Vanderbilt. Along the way, I met some, and I was shaped by some significant faculty members, professors like Dr. Charles Cofer, who is considered the father of African American biblical studies, and Randall Bailey, who taught me, was my first Old Testament teacher at ITC. And here, my advisor was Dr. Renita Weems, who directed my dissertation. Dr. Cofer taught me the importance of cultural context in the Bible, look particularly at African context and finding not only myself, but my community in the text. And Randall Bailey taught us how to think critically about the problems we faced and how those problems were made relevant in our own interpretations. And finally, Dr. Anita Weems really took me and honed me and made me a scholar. Any faults I have are my own, but what I find that's good in my work has to do with the caliber of instruction I got from great professors. And so I'm grateful for my journey. Along the journey, what I found to be most important, not just the education that I got, but the experience I got along the way. I served as pastor of Old National United Methodist Church for several years in Atlanta, Georgia. And it was one of those congregations that accepted a young student pastor and taught me that while it was extraordinarily important that I studied hard, but it was also important that I took what I knew, and I knew, not only did I know the books, but I had to know the lives of the people. I had to understand where religion, if you will, where religion hit the ground. In other words, where the rubber met the road, and the kinds of difficulties that real people faced as they attempted to live faithful lives. And so I was blessed to be the pastor of that church for several years, where I really learned not only how to care for and lead a community, but I also learned why biblical interpretation is so important for our churches. I left there and served as the university chaplain at Clark Atlanta University for several years. And there I met some of the brightest and most inquisitive students who really pushed me to think not only outside of my education, but also to think outside of the confines of regular churches.
Very good. And of course, what we're going to, excuse me, doctor, what we're going to do is to take our first commercial break, and then we'll come back and complete some of the information that you're giving us now. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Was she at Vanderbilt University?
Yes, she was my advisor at Vanderbilt, yes.
When was that? When she advised you at Vanderbilt University?
That would have been 97, 98.
Yeah, I think I met her about that time.
Yeah, I was till about 2002. I graduated 2002, 2003. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, I know Professor Weems.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is the second segment, right. And this is when we'll start talking about the institutional. I'll introduce the show itself. Mm-hmm. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Herbert Marbury from Vanderbilt University, and he's giving us some information in reference to the institutional church. And he's also given us some excellent information concerning his background and some of the experiences that led him to us this morning. And so, Dr. Marbury, let's see if we might be able to pick up where we left off and to have you to start talking about African Americans and the institutional church from your perspective.
Well, I think what's foundational for the institutional church for African Americans, and perhaps foundational for most churches, but particularly for black churches, is the Bible. Mm-hmm. You find it in the pulpits. We preach from it. It is our authority for our moral life, and it is for most Christian communities the Word of God. And I tell my students, every time they step into a pulpit in the midst of a community of believers and they speak from the Bible, they are speaking for that community. What is the Word of God? And so one of the things that captured my attention when I was a student at ITC and then later at Vanderbilt, I had good professors like Professor Victor Anderson and Professor Lewis Baldwin, who interests me not only in ethics, that is how black communities think about what's right and wrong, but also interested me in the history of the black church. And from that standpoint, I wanted to know, well, why do black churches, why do churches in general think of the Bible and use the Bible so differently? For example, you look in Nashville and you've got churches from one end of the city to the other. And on fundamental issues, we disagree, and yet the same book is being preached from our pulpits. And I began to wonder, well, what's going on? It's not the book is the same. Mm-hmm. What's going on in the way that we interpret these texts?
It's the interpretation of the book.
Absolutely, it's the way. And so I wanted to study how African Americans historically have interpreted the Bible. And so that's the reason I wrote Pillars of Cloud and Fire. It begins to look at African American biblical interpretation from the antebellum period, starting with slavery. And I look at various examples. A radical example and a conservative example in the antebellum period, beginning with Absalom Jones and David Walker. I move on to look at Reconstruction with Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and John Jasper. The Harlem Renaissance with Zora Neale Hurston. Then the era of civil rights with Adam Clayton Powell and Martin Luther King Jr. And finally, I look at the era of Black Power with Albert Clegg. Each one takes up the book of Exodus, but takes it up in a very different way. And they take it up based on what I talked about earlier. That is, what are the relevant challenges that my community faces? How can I continue to make the Word of God, the Bible, relevant? And so during the antebellum period, Absalom Jones and David Walker both take up the story of Exodus almost literally. That if God delivered the children of Israel from Egypt, across the Red Sea into the Promised Land, then God will do the same. And the Promised Land was freedom from slavery. Well, freedom from slavery came, and we weren't free. We faced Jim Crow and segregation. And so if you go to the era of Reconstruction, and you look at sermons, the Promised Land doesn't look like freedom from slavery. Emancipation is no longer identified with the Promised Land. Uplift is. Well, how do we educate now? How do we move from just emancipation to education and the kind of cultural attainment that will lift black communities? And after Reconstruction, that changes again in the Harlem Renaissance. This idea that we need to throw off the manacles of slavery, the old Southern sort of African-American rebirth. And a rebirth. That's right. The Renaissance man. Renaissance man, Renaissance woman. But for the Harlem Renaissance writers, for the most part, except for Zora Neale Hurston, they were really thinking rather in sexist terms. So they were thinking the new Negro was the new Negro man. But Zora Neale Hurston, I thought, was one of the most interesting figures during that time. Her Moses, Man of the Mountain, helped African Americans rethink the Exodus story in a way that took the focus off a singular figure like a Moses figure and put it on the community and asked us to imagine together what it would mean if we all together walked into the Promised Land and we weren't waiting for or dependent upon one singular figure or God to send one person to deliver a whole group of people. And then I go on to look at the era of civil rights with Adam Clayton Powell and Martin Luther King Jr., who understood the Exodus story in the Promised Land as being included as full citizens, that we would certainly enjoy, as Dr. Martin Luther King would say, the blessings of liberty. And if you look at his speeches, he takes the rhetoric from the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the kind of rhetoric that founded our nation, and he connects it to the Exodus story. And freedom means becoming a full citizen. Well, at a certain point, by the end of the Civil Rights Movement, we find that Albert Clegg wants to do something very different with that. That there's the frustration that has risen because African Americans still aren't enjoying the blessings of liberty. There is a move to take that story and to claim it for ourselves and to claim the power to change our lives. Not that power, but not placing it in the founding documents, but placing it in black communities themselves. And so we get the Black Power movement. So I wanted to look at the various ways that we have interpreted one singular book, the book of Exodus, over the course of a long period of time. But my concern was to show that each interpreter started first with the concerns of their community at that time. And I wanted to encourage my students who were going to serve churches and serve in religious communities to do the same. You know, during this second segment, the final segment, what I would like for you to do is to, and I think you've mentioned Adam Clayton Powell and Dr. Martin Luther King. I think that these are two giants, but I think that people know more about Dr. King than they do about Adam Clayton Powell. And so during this this final segment, when we come back, we've got about 45 or 50 seconds here. But when we come back during this final segment, what I'd like for you to do, and I say this now because I don't want to forget to push it forward. I want you to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King and Adam Clayton Powell, and with emphasis up on Adam Clayton Powell and why he is significant and what the things that you've been doing. Okay? And so what we'll do, we'll take this final commercial break, and then we'll come back and we'll deal with some aspects of Dr. Martin Luther King and Adam Clayton Powell. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. You look like you've been doing this all your life, man. I got no, this is my first time. Oh man, you're good. Because you got the information. That's what makes you good. See, when you have the information, and
you can do it.
Yeah,
See, and so when we come back during this final segment, I'll introduce the show again. But and in case I forget, but what I'd like for you to do is to look at these two personalities within the context of all the things that you've studied about them and writing your book and books and et cetera, and to look and to examine those two individuals, Dr. Martin Luther King and Adam Clayton Powell, and point out whatever the similarities or difficulties and et cetera, whatever you want to talk about. But I think that that would be good to end this, because these are the two most important individuals in terms of contemporary black society and the institutional church. You see, and I'd like to know more about about this myself. You see, and so when we come back, we'll do that. We'll do this. We will have, excuse me, we'll have 10 minutes to do this. I need some water myself. Yeah. Okay, very good. Thank you. Now, HMarbury7.
Yes, that's it.
Okay, well, I have to do that every time. See, you're giving us some excellent, and I don't want to make any noise. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. HMarbury7 from Vanderbilt University, and he's giving us some information in reference to African Americans and the institutional church. Doctor, let's see if we might be able to pick up during this final segment to talk about what I consider to be two very, very significant individuals that you've already mentioned, Dr. Martin Luther King and Adam Clayton Powell. And let's see what you know about those individuals and how they fit into what we're trying to do at this particular time.
Right. Well, in the chapter on the Civil Rights Movement, I take up Dr. King and Adam Clayton Powell as a pillar of cloud and fire. Dr. King as a pillar of cloud, and and Adam Clayton Powell as a pillar of fire. And when I say pillar of fire, I mean someone who kind of brandished, if you will, his brashness, a boldness, a certain radical nature. Adam Clayton Powell was very clear while he was in Congress that he called himself the baddest Negro in Congress.
Yeah, go on.
Right. and he flouted the rules. He didn't stomach segregation. He didn't take kindly to the kinds of conventions that made African Americans second class. And part it had to do with his upbringing, had to do with who he was, but it also had to do with, I think, growing up in Harlem. And he really was, I call him, a son of the Harlem Renaissance. He was the new Negro, as I understand it, that the Harlem Renaissance writers had hoped for. He started one of the first boycotts of the public transportation system in Harlem. One of the first sort of public service programs at his church, at Abyssinian Baptist Church. And by the time he went to Congress, he was pastoring the largest Protestant congregation in the nation. Adam Clayton Powell is known for his he's not only known for his pastoral work, but he's known for the Powell Amendment, which was a little known sort of codicil that he would add to every bill that sent funding for public accommodations, and it was a bill that said that public funding could not be used for segregated institutions. It angered Southern segregationists throughout the country, but it also angered African Americans because some of those schools were African American schools in the South. Although they were segregated, they were starved because they also needed the public funding. But Clayton Powell didn't care. What he was concerned about was ensuring that those who wanted segregation had to pay for it. And so he starved them all to death until he was able to get the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. That was his victory in the Civil Rights Bill of 64. He was there when Lyndon Baines Johnson signed it, but so was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And King, who was, they were both princes of the Black Baptist Church. Adam Clayton Powell had gone to, attended school in New York. His father, his father, in many ways, had groomed him to be a prince of the Baptist Church. Martin Luther King,
as Dr. King,
as Dr. King's father.
Good.
His father pastored Abyssinian, while Dr. King's father pastored Ebenezer, and they both groomed their sons for the roles that they would take. They both went to elite schools, Morehouse College in the South, and they both were products of the black middle class. But where they differed, I think, was Dr. King grew up in the segregated South, born right at 1929, just as America was going into the Great Depression. And Dr. King saw a different and a brutal side of white segregationist power. And it was something that I don't think Adam Clayton Powell saw. That shaped Dr. King in a way that that Adam Clayton Powell didn't.
And led to his assassination.
Yes, and led to his assassination. Absolutely. In a sense, both of them were assassinated. Dr. King, literally. Good. Adam Clayton Powell was politically destroyed because of his brashness. So what I find with now, both of them come at a time when African Americans have migrated, and I think this is also important to make the making of these two figures. African Americans began to migrate immediately after the Civil War. Every 10 years, you look at the census, you see more and more African Americans migrating toward the west and toward the north. Except for the 10 years during the Depression, when you don't see much migration, but you see, and so African Americans migrated from rural communities in the South to cities in the South like Montgomery and Atlanta. That created the possibility for a Montgomery bus boycott, but also created the possibility for an Abyssinian Baptist church, which was Adam Clayton Powell's political base, and which became for Martin Luther King the base for the Montgomery bus boycott and Ebenezer. And so as these two figures began to interpret the biblical text, they thought of the Exodus story for Adam Clayton Powell. The Exodus story guaranteed for African Americans in his sermon, "Stop Blaming Everyone Else," which he preached at Abyssinian Baptist Church in the 50s. It was a sermon that invited African Americans to fully participate in what it meant to be a citizen, take responsibility for what it meant to be a citizen.
He really pushed African Americans.
He pushed African Americans to take responsibility for it. And so for Martin Luther King Jr., however, there was a different way of understanding the biblical text. Martin Luther King Jr., growing up in the South, personal piety became very important. In as much as his political work, personal piety became a mask, if you will, for Martin Luther King Jr. He knew that if he was leading African Americans out into the streets to demand full inclusion, he knew how to use the television cameras, how to use the public square, and the way he used it was to lead African Americans into acts of personal piety. That's what I call the pillar of cloud. He masked, in many ways, his real intentions. He would lead them to pray in the streets, to sing songs. And when the television cameras came and they saw African Americans living out some of the, these kind of virtuous virtuous expressions, right? Singing church songs, praying, holding hands, praying for their enemies. Not only was the South was embarrassed, the nation was embarrassed, but they were not only embarrassed domestically, they were embarrassed internationally. And so I call that the pillar of cloud, because just as a cloud kind of blends in seamlessly, Martin Luther King's tactics blended in with the American moral landscape. These were virtues for America.
And this was also Dr. Martin Luther King behind the veil.
Yes.
And you know more about that because
Yes.
of one of your professors, I'm sure.
Dr. Baldwin.
Dr. Baldwin,
Right.
who talked about
Right.
that and et cetera. And I think that
Yes.
you're an excellent reflection
Yes.
in terms of what he said about that and some of the things that you're saying
Yes.
about that. And I want you to know that the information that you're giving us now is very, very precious.
Right.
And I think that understanding these two individuals
Right.
and some of the things that they faced and how different they were, one from the north and one from the south,
yeah.
but yet and still they had the same commitment, and while they went about it differently, they had the same commitment in terms of the uplift of African Americans to eventually reach the promised land.
Right.
And I think that that's what we're still trying to move toward.
And that's
Is
what
that-
that's what we're still trying. That's what I hope that as you read my book, but as we think about biblical interpretation today, we face police shootings of Black and brown, African American and Hispanic, unemployment, high underemployment, and questions around whether or not we can provide adequate education and health care. And I want to know, why is it that we have to go out into the streets to hear the word of God that Black Lives Matter? Why not in the church? Now, to be sure, there's some churches who are doing that. But my question is, how do we interpret the Bible in ways that are relevant for us?
Very good. Let me thank you,
Yes.
Doctor, during this last few seconds for coming by and giving us that
Thank you.
excellent information. And let me encourage you to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much.